and I didn't want to read it anymore.
Okay, you're not the only one, I think. I guess Alice Munro fits into the category of, maybe one calls it literary fiction.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, what does that mean? Harder to read? I don't know. And it's very personal, because it's not that her language is difficult, it's not that she does anything fancy with style or, you know, changing of, I don't know, voices or times, or well, okay. So she happens to be, I really savor and enjoy her story. Maybe enjoy, well, yes, enjoy. I don't mean that it, you know, they're laugh aloud, out loud, and they're funny, although there are some definitely very humorous moments in her, in her writing. But she is, and she's considered, and really in my opinion with great validity, to be one of the greatest English writers who wrote, she just passed away this past May, so I was like, very recently, who wrote short stories. And she's always said that. And you know, we said that when we looked at, and I was looking to see, because we've done a number of her books over the years, right? We've been, this group, or at least I have been doing this book club since 1981. Like over 40 years, I know, it's a little bit, when the library was up in the cote-saint-luc shopping center. So there were a lot of Alice Munro books that we talked about over the years, and the stories, you know, I don't remember all of them, and although when I read this book, some of the stories did come back to me. I remembered having read them, and it must have been 20 years ago. I don't have a very good memory, but it was just little bits and pieces that stuck in my mind. And of course, she achieved, I mean, why did I pick Alice Munro to do? First of all, I was going to do a book by hers anyway after she passed away in May, because she is really one of the, and even if you, I mean, you read 3 stories and you said you were bored, but when you look at them and the way they're crafted, they really are, she has such a talent. I mean, she's brilliant. It could be not interesting to you, but as a crafts person, they're really something very, very special. She's a Nobel Prize winning, you know, writer, and that doesn't go lightly. But of course, unfortunately, and this is like, I don't want to talk about this right away, but I get to call it the elephant in the room, was that, which everybody probably knows this a bit, at least I even cut out an article from the National Post in July of this past year. So Alice Munro passed away in May at the age of 90, she was almost 93 years old. She was born in 1931. So just a couple of months short of her 93rd birthday. And then 2 months later, in July of this past year, her daughter published an article in the Toronto Star, in which she describes what happened. Does everybody know about this, or am I? Okay, so in July of this past year, her daughter Andrea Skinner published an article that described the abuse that she had undergone as a very young girl, from the age of 9 until, I don't know, for about 6 years after that, at the hands of Alice Munro's late second husband, who was this daughter's stepfather, because Alice Munro she actually had 4 daughters. I read one of them lived only for a day, but 3 daughters who lived. And this is the youngest daughter, and they were all Alice Munro's daughters with her first husband. Alice Munro was married twice, and then after she divorced her first husband and went back, they were living in Vancouver at the time, and she went back to Ontario and married her second husband, Gerald Fremkin, who she knew from a young age. She and her first husband and this second husband were students together at the University of Western Ontario when Alice Munro was there as a young woman attending university. So she went and she married him, and then her daughter describes the sexual abuse that this second husband of Alice Munro's subjected her to from the age of, as a very young, 9 years old, for 6 years, and then it stopped. And this was seemingly, well, at least the first time that this news garnered, that was put out in the public. She had told, what happened, it seemed, she had told her mother about it several years after it happened, and her mother had said, this is not, it's not my business, it's between you and your stepfather, and it had stopped by then, and she said, I'm not gonna leave him, I'm in love with him too much, and then it was never talked about publicly, although, anyway, I'll go into the details of all of this, but there is this. So then it became, because Alice Munro was so well known and was so famous and was one of the Canadian writers to be known internationally, like Margaret Atwood, and you have, there were a few of them, Robertson Davies back then, and Gabrielle Roy, like we have our authors who were known internationally, but Alice Munro, and she won the Nobel Prize, and she won all these prizes, and she was beloved, and her stories were used in universities and taught in courses, and they were examples, and she was I don't know, ironically, but yeah, maybe a hero, a feminist from way back when because of what she represented. She was born in 1931, and she went on and she had a career, and she became a writer and so well known. And then this comes out, and then it's as if this goddess has fallen. Okay, the daughter, to her credit, waited until her mother had died before she wrote this article. Why she wrote it, I don't, you can argue all kinds of things. But certainly what it did was it left a lot of people very upset. Their ideas of Alice Munro, who she was and what she represented through her writings were demolished, shattered there, so this was a very, very big deal, and it discussed in, literary circles. I mean, it didn't really, the world is still gonna turn, and it's not war or peace in countries, but for those who care, and for those who appreciated her writing and thought of her as so wonderful, it's a little bit, it was a lot disturbing. And it raises questions which are age-old questions, which again, I'll talk about the book for a bit, and then I guess, maybe we could come back to talk to this, because it really, when you read the stories, like if you read the stories in the book and the subject that she writes about, and the subject of the stories in this book are pretty similar to the subjects that she usually wrote about in all her other collections. She really writes it as her first collection was called The Lives of Girls and Women. And that's what she focused on. She also had male characters, it's not that she didn't, but that was her focus. And she writes about all kinds of things, and with great honesty. Alice Munro had a way of writing that everything was put under her writerly microscope and examined in the greatest of detail and written about in a style. I think this is what appeals to me, because I appreciate writers who don't use very many adjectives, or adverbs, who don't write in a flowery style, and she has that style. And in fact, in an interview, there was an interview that I listened to last night with Rex Murphy. You've got to listen to Rex Murphy over the years on the CBC, so he's a wonderful interviewer. And he said to her that, you have a certain kind of prose. And he introduced her in this interview by saying that Alice Munro is the master of the short story. And she said that when she started out of her writing career, she always wanted to be a writer. It's so interesting when these writers say they knew that they knew from a very early age they wanted to be a writer. She said she always wanted to be a writer. She started to write in her teens. And she said, you know, the idea was always that I was going to write a novel, because that's what writers do, you know, unless you're writing nonfiction, or a playwright or a poet, but otherwise, a novel. So she said, so short stories were the practice for novel writing. And so she practiced and practiced and practiced, and once she tried to write a novel, but she realized, no, that didn't go, that wasn't her thing, and she went back to writing a short story. So Rex Murphy, when he was interviewing her, this was a number of years ago, yeah, maybe, I don't know, at least, yeah, I don't remember after which book he was interviewing her, and he said, the short story is the neatest of all prose forms. That it's concise, and it's harder to write a good short story than it is a novel. Because a novel doesn't have, you know, you can write a novel that's, I don't know, 150 pages or up to, you know, unlimited, 600 pages if you're 1,000 pages, some of these novels are. But a short story, again, okay, no official, you know, I don't know what makes something a short story versus a novella, but it has to be short, and you have to say what you want to say effectively in that short form, and you have to do whatever you're going to do. In Alice Munro's case, it is, she creates characters, and she has the ability to create characters and get you involved in their lives to a degree. When you're finished reading the story, you think, it's almost as if you read a novel about them, except you didn't. You read just a short story. And that, you know, when you look back on it as a craft, it's remarkable. At least to me, it's remarkable what she can do. So when Rex Murphy said, he introduced her by saying, the short story is the neatest of all prose forms. Even though, and she said, I wanted to write novels when I started to write, and then I realized that just wasn't for me. And he said to her, and you know, what else about your writing? And she said, well, he said, how do you get that the way you write? Like, it's all so, every word, every sentence is important. And that's why, go back and reread them. Like, I reread them over and over again over the last couple of months, because and each time, maybe because I don't pay attention so much properly when I'm reading the first time, that when I read them over, and new things come to light each time. Look at each sentence that she writes. And so she said, you know what I do when I write? And so did, I forget somebody else read, yes, recently I read an article, John Banville, who's one of my favorite writers also, who did a couple of John Banville's books. He writes mysteries under the name of Benjamin Black. He's an Irish writer, and he also has a very, what's the word? Well, I call it no adjective, no adverb, no frills, concise, pared down style. And he was talking about Georges Simenon, who's also one of my favorite crime writers from way back. And Georges Simenon was notorious for writing many, many books. Like, I don't know, he wrote a book very quickly, but he said when he would go and look at his manuscript again, he would cut out, anytime he saw an adjective or an adverb that had snuck in there, he took it out. So Alice Munro said the same thing. When I reread my stories, and if I come across a beautiful turn of phrase, I cut it out. That's what she said. So I thought, okay, so as I say, this happens to appeal to me. I don't like flowery writing. And so this is so that's what she said. She said that, and when she was interviewed by Rex Murray, she was already in her, it was about almost 20 years ago. So she was in her 70s. And she said, I can't play bridge. I don't play tennis. All those things that people learn and I admire, there had not seemed to have been time for. But, she said, what I find that there is time for is looking out the window. So there you have a writer. Not tennis, not bridge, not those things that other people do, even though she admires people who do them, but looking out the window. So that's, as a writer, what you have to do. You have to look out the window. You have to sit, you have to think, you have to reflect. And that's what she did. She said that, and her childhood, and if you read her stories, she writes, as one reviewer said, Here is the story that Munro keeps telling. A bright young girl grows up in rural Ontario without much money. Her mother is sickly or dead. Her father is a school teacher whose second wife is problematic. And the girl, as soon as she can, escapes from the hinterland by way of a scholarship or some decisive, self-interested act. And that's how he sums up Alice Munro's writing in general, and Runaway fits into this. And he says, this was in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, the first paragraph of the review says, the reviewer, Runaway, the collection, is so good that I don't want to talk about it here. Quotation can't do the book justice, and neither can synopsis. The way to do it justice is to read it, which leaves me with the simple instruction that I began with. Read Alice Munro, read Alice Munro. So basically, if you read this book, and if you've read her other books, and you think to yourself, she seems to keep telling the same stories over and over again. And yes, she does. She does basically tell similar stories. Everyone is different because everyone has a little snippet of a life, of a story. They're different characters. But very often, there's this bright young girl who grows up in rural Ontario without much money. Her mother is sickly or has already passed away. Her father, possibly a school teacher, not always, and if you read the collection, you know how this fits into it. Second wife is problematic, so there's step parents involved. And the girl, as soon as she can, she escapes, either because she's bright and she wins a scholarship, which again you have in the stories in Runaway, or she does something, and always in self-interest. Like, none of these characters are particularly, you think about them after and you think, well, they're not particularly sympathetic characters. I don't know if I'd ever find myself being friends with any of the characters in the book. But their motives, their thoughts, they are all described so realistic. As I say, it's like Alice Munro puts the characters under a microscope and observes, and she writes up her observations. Maybe you could think of her stories like that. And as the Washington Post book reviewer said, that here are 8 wonderful stories. All seem at first to be about women, but they're not really only about women. They're about being human. How that condition, the human condition, cradles us and limits us. And most of the stories in the book begin in the relatively obscure past. Those of you who read the book will remember that it's often, the author is saying, so I haven't been in this place in 40 years, and I was driving along the road and I was looking for this place that I remember. And so their time and past is very much part of many of the stories. They proceed then slowly and carefully into the present. And it's as if there is a stately movement through the story, and many of them end up being about loss, the inevitable loss of everything that we think we have when we are young. And especially, so she wrote Runaway 20 years ago, so she was in her early 70s. And she said in that interview with Rex Murphy, she said, yeah, well, I write differently now in my 70s than I did when I wrote my first published story, when I was 19, or she was first published when she was in her late 30s. By that time, she had been married, her first husband, and she had these 3 young children, and they were living in Vancouver, where she founded a bookstore. There's still a bookstore in this Vancouver, Victoria, I forget now, called Munro Books. In fact, there was a long piece that I read last night by a woman who works there in her bookstore. She wrote this after after the daughter wrote the article about what Alice Munro's second husband had done to her. And this woman, this young woman owner or employee in the bookstore was just devastated. And she wrote a whole article about how she doesn't know what to do and how the bookstore doesn't know what to do. And the bookstore is called Munro Books, because Alice Munro and her husband, her first husband James, founded it when they lived, it must have been Vancouver, and it was a wonderful bookstore, and it's been in existence in 1963, I think, and does very well, which is, you know, not some small feat for a bookstore, a little independent bookstore nowadays. And this woman was just, I don't know what to do, I don't know how can we do that? And it's called Munro Books, and you know, we used to like show all her books in the window, and especially after she passed away in May, then, you know, now, do we take all her books down? Do we take her pictures down? The University of Western Ontario that had a chair, the Alice Munro chair, and I forget the exact title of it. What do we do? Do we take the name away for this? And again, as I said, this is not a new question, because it's an age-old question of, do you separate the art, the artist from the art? Whether it's a painter, whether it's a poet, whether it's a writer of anything. Because people's personal lives are very often not exactly, you know, what you would like them to be if you're going to idolize this artist, and when things come to light, then what do you do with it? So if the person lived hundreds of years ago, well then, you know, okay. Or, you know, if it was Picasso and he wasn't very nice, or if it was Hemingway and he wasn't very nice. But this is all very fresh, and this is Alice Munro, and what do you do with it? And you know, so this is why it became very timely. As I said, like this hadn't happened when I was thinking of doing this book, but it adds another level, because when you read the stories, there is a lot of betrayal there. There's a lot of description of the characters' motives, and they're mainly like they're male characters, but they're female characters too, and not very nice, or at least not what, you know, you would think like a good, decent, moral person would do. So this revelation about Alice Munro, not that she was guilty of the abuse, but the fact that it comes out that her daughter approached her and told her what Alice Munro's husband at the time was doing, and Alice Munro said, well, you know, I love him too much, I'm not going to leave him. Although apparently she did briefly leave him, but it wasn't because of her daughter telling her of the abuse, it was because she suspected her husband of infidelity, and then she went back to him. So this woman who is this, you know, idealized figure in the Canadian literature world, turns out to, you know, her personal life was far from neat. So, do you not read an author's short stories now? Do you not teach them? In this article in the National Post, a second part of it was talking about one of the professors, a McGill English literature professor by the name of Robert Lecker, was planning a graduate seminar course, and he was going to teach Alice Munro for the winter 2025 term. He was being interviewed in July. And he was planning his course, and now he's thinking, I don't know, how do I teach Alice Munro? Am I, you know, do I still do it, and how do I do it in a different way? And I mean, just the fact that I'm going on and on about it here just tells you that, but again, you could say, look, it's an age-old problem. Now it's very fresh because it just happened, and we are all up in arms because, you know, nowadays with the Me Too movement, is that, you know, women don't have to, and you don't have to suffer under this, and women have, you think, but plus ça change, as we all know, ça reste la même chose. So, in her collection, there are 8 stories. It's interesting because those of you who read it will notice that the stories all have one-word titles. The first story is the story that gives the book its title. It's called Runaway. The second 3 stories are linked. They're the same character, and there are 3 different periods in her life. Chance, Soon, Silence. Again, these titles are very, like, the next ones are called Passion, Trespasses, Tricks, and Powers. One-word titles, and they are very, very apt when you read the stories. So let me just talk a little bit about the first story, because the first story is the first story in the collection. It's called Runaway. It gives the book its title. And some of these, I think many of these stories, this is the first time that they were all published together, since 2004, so 20 years ago, in this collection. But a number of them had been previously published in the New Yorker. You know, many of these short story writers, they get published in the New Yorker or Atlantic or in other magazines, but the New Yorker is known for publishing short stories. So the first story, which is called Runaway, it opens and it tells the story of a young woman by the name of Carla who is married, and she and her husband Clark run a small riding school, and they live out in the country, they have stables, they have horses, and they run a riding school. And some seasons are good seasons and some seasons are not so good seasons, so they generally don't have all that many clients. And when we first meet them in this story, things are tight. The season it's been very, very rainy, and it's been a very financially not good season for them. They live in a mobile home, which Carla keeps trying to fix up, and she's described as physically a kind of golden girl. Like we envision her, she's tall and she's sturdy and she has long blonde hair and she's physically very, very appealing, but she's also she's attractive and she's also strong, and she's very different from her husband. Her husband is like, you read his character and you think he's a creep. Why is she with him? But she fell in love with him when she was a young girl, and we find out that she grew up in a middle-class home, and her parents were comfortable, and she grew up in a regular home, where middle-class Canadian urban home where her parents wanted her to go to college. She's in love with horses and anything horse-related. And she agrees with her parents when she finishes high school that, okay, she'll go to college, but only if she can become a veterinarian. But what happens is that she takes riding lessons and she definitely falls very hard for this attractive, not very nice young man, a kind of drifter by the name of Clark. She marries him, and they go off, and he has a farm, and he has this horse, riding school business, and she goes to live there. So she gives up her solid middle class life to be with this guy, and to be really always struggling. If the season is good, it's okay, and if the season is not so good, it's not so okay. And she, as well, she works, this Carla, one of the main characters in the story, she also works cleaning for an older, well-to-do university couple who are their nearby neighbors. And Sylvia, who is the wife and now is a widow because the husband has passed away, this is the neighbors, she has just returned in the story after a holiday in Greece. And she tells Carla that she needs some cleaning help, and Clark, the husband, sends Carla over to clean for the woman because money is tight and they can use it, so he sends her off to clean. And that's kind of like the outline of the story, and then Carla tells Sylvia, the older woman, that the husband has just passed away. He's been sick and he's been taken care of at home. And after he dies, all the room where he's been sick is cleaned up, and Sylvia goes away on this holiday with her two girlfriends to Greece, and she comes back, and Carla goes and helps her. Carla says how unhappy she is, and she starts to cry, and Carla comes across as a very immature young woman. She's a golden girl physically, but inside she's seemingly not very mature, and she starts to cry and complain to Sylvia about how unhappy she is. And so Sylvia, the older woman, thinks that what she's going to do to help this young woman, she's going to give her money, and she tells her Sylvia has a friend in Toronto, so if Carla wants to run away from her husband, who borders on the abusive, and the relationship really looks at this kind of woman who falls for a man who is very much attached and unable in the end to leave this man, even if he doesn't treat her very well. But there's this powerful physical attraction that keeps them together, and even though we, the readers, think, but he's not nice, he's really doesn't treat you very well, but as we know, you could look in on other people's lives and think you know what you're doing, but emotions and other forces are much stronger than being rational. But this Sylvia is going to do her good deeds, so she she gives Carla clothes, and she gives her money for a bus ticket, and she gives her friend's address in Toronto, and she says to her, you go away and get away from this abusive husband. Are her motives purely, is she just doing this because she really loves Carla and wants the best for her? Or is she also doing it because she's a little bit attracted to Carla and wants to get her away from this husband? There are all kinds of undercurrents at play here. Again, all told with Alice Munro's characteristic spareness of style. That's why you can read these stories over a few times. And even though they seem so simple on the surface, there is a lot underneath. So Carla goes, she gets on the bus, and she's riding along on the bus, and all of a sudden she realizes that she can never leave this Clark. She just loves him too much. She's too tied to him. And she makes the bus driver stop, and she gets off the bus, and she goes back home, and she calls him, blubbering, and he can't stand it when she cries. He thinks she's an immature little child, but he still keeps her around. And he comes and he picks her up, and they're back together. But the part of the story that's a little bit of a fantastic thing is that on this horse farm, Carla has a pet. And it's this little goat named Flora. And Flora, her husband has bought Flora to keep the horses company. But she becomes Carla's little personal pet. And Carla goes off into the barn or to the stables, and she goes and she speaks to Flora. And one day, Flora disappears. And she could have run away, because goats run away. As she said, Flora went to find another goat and get herself pregnant, and then there's a scene towards the end of the book where Flora, and almost in a vision, in a dreamlike episode, those of you who read the story will remember it, appears again. And Clark has meanwhile gone over to Sylvia to tell her, stay out of my marriage, you leave my wife alone, I know it was you who helped her run away, don't you ever do anything like that. And he's a menacing, creepy man. But then this goat appears, and so the scene is kind of softened, and where you think that something is going to happen and Clark is going to do something to Sylvia. Goat comes, Clark leaves with Flora with the admonition, don't come near my wife again, you leave us alone, and he goes back home. Flora, we don't know until the end of the story, Flora never appears. And Carla only finds out about it by opening a letter that Sylvia has written to her, apologizing. Sylvia apologized, I never should have meddled in your personal life, that was a mistake on my part, I'm wishing you the best. And she moves away, she moves closer to the job. She's a teacher, a botany teacher in a college 40 miles away, and leaves Carla and Clark alone. But the end of the story, remember that one? I'm not going to go into detail about all the stories, but just because this is the title story. The end of the story is when Carla finds this letter, and she realizes that the goat had come back, but did Clark do something with it, or did Flora run away on her own? We, the reader, suspect Clark of some foul play with this goat, and why would he do that? Well, there's a little bit of there's more to her Alice Munro stories. They seem on the surface very simple. That Flora has run away and then come back, so she's also the other runaway in the story, not just Carla, the young wife. And in this act of cruelty, because it's not, we don't know for sure what the ending is, but you're more suspect that Clark has done something, has gotten rid of that goat, so that Carla doesn't, and why? And Carla loved that little goat, and they don't have any children of their own. So why would he do something as cruel as to take away her goat? And that's how the story ends. So that's the opening story in the collection, just to give you an idea of what Alice Munro writes about. It's about, it's an interesting, really, a study in power and in control, and of how people control other people's lives, sometimes in well-meaning ways. They try to help, as does this Sylvia to Carla, or in ways that we look as outsiders and think are cruel and abusive, as the way Clark treats his wife. But in their private lives, she is very happy, and she also does a few things in the story that are not quite upright and upfront with her husband, and gets into trouble with them as well. And so she manages to do all of this in a story of not that many pages, in 47 pages to be exact, is the first story. So that's the first one. And then you have the next 3 stories, which are the ones that I said were linked, in which we meet the main character. Her name is Juliet, and she's a young teacher at 21 years old. And again, and so you start to see the pattern of a young woman. In the case of Carla, she's bright enough. She's not described as a great intellectual, but if she wouldn't have met this Clark, she would have gone to university and she would have maybe become a veterinarian, or she would have, but she doesn't. She goes off with this man who just, she just falls passionately in love with and goes off to live with him. The second trio of stories, you have this young woman, Juliet, who comes from a small town where she is an oddity because she's very, very smart, and she has her passion are the ancients, are the Greek and the Latin writers, the classics, which in a small town in Ontario, they didn't even teach these subjects in her high school, but she goes on to university, and she is an odd, a feeling out of place in that rural Ontario setting, and that's Alice Munro's territory. So to go back a little bit to, just to remind us of Alice Munro's background, she was born 1931 in a town called Wingham, Ontario, and that, just like it's always said, certain writers have their territory, like Faulkner had his territory and other writers did. Alice Munro's territory, sometimes it's Vancouver and the West Coast because she lived there for a while, but then a lot of it is this small town or small towns in the area of southwestern Ontario. That's where Alice Munro was born. That's where her family came from, her Scottish family. There was a book that she wrote. Do you remember we did it? And I forget what year, I think it was maybe 2008, The View from Castle Rock, where she wrote about, it was a change from her others because she wrote about her ancestors who came over from Scotland. So these were her grandparents and her great-grandparents, and they bought land, they became farmers, and they did quite well. She was raised, and remember, she's born 1931, so that's the Great Depression. She was a child, she grew up in the Depression. And she says she was raised on what she described as a collapsing enterprise of a fox and mink farm. You remember reading about her, that her father had this fox and mink farm, and that's where she grew up. But it was the Great Depression, so there was great struggle there and not very much money. There was also her mother, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease when Alice Munro, who was the eldest of the children, was 12 or 13 years old. So she, as a young girl in the Depression, and then also had the responsibility in this rural, this small town Ontario, well, there was a farm even, so it was more rural, of taking care of the family because her mother was not able to. So she said she was an avid reader. She was drawn to the work of literary legends, Lucy Maud Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables fame and the other ones, and Charles Dickens. She began making up stories in her mind, she said, after discovering the works of Alfred Tennyson. She also said that she took over most of the domestic roles in the household after her mother, who had been a school teacher, so school teachers also figure prominently in Alice Munro's characters, after her mother was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And she said the work gave her a sense of responsibility, purpose, being important. As she looks back, she said, it did not bother me at all. And she began writing short stories when she was a teenager. She graduated valedictorian of her high school class in 1949, which earned her a 2-year scholarship to the University of Western Ontario in London, which was, and that's why you have in her stories, in this book and her other stories, the young girl from the small town or from the farm who is very, very bright and an oddity among her classmates, and she wins. So she's valedictorian, Alice Munro. She won a scholarship to University of Western Ontario because her family didn't have the money to send her, and it was there that she met her first husband, and also the to-be second husband. She met both of them when she was there at university. Her first published story was called The Dimensions of a Shadow. It appeared at her university in Western's undergraduate creative writing magazine in the spring of 1950. And 2 more pieces followed in their magazine, with all 3 receiving praise for their exploration of the lives of girls and women. So she was launched on what would be her career, writing about the lives of girls and women from a very early age. And the monotony of girls' early years, she wrote in a book, a collection called The Moons of Jupiter, which was published in 1978, which described wives yawning, napping, visiting, drinking coffee, and folding diapers, their husbands then coming home at night from the city across the water. That was her description of her own early, her years as a young married woman, because she married her husband just there after graduating university. They went where her husband had a job, and she stayed home. She had her children, and as it was in the early 50s, it was not typical for a woman, at least a married woman who had a husband who should be supporting her, to go out to work. So she wrote about, whenever she found time to write. And that was another thing she said. The reason I started to write short stories, she said, was because I didn't have time to write anything longer. I had young children and no help at home. So, as many women writers find, or anybody who tries to have a day job and then write, to write a novel is a huge undertaking. A short story seems a lot more manageable. She said, my husband and I, this is of course looking back from years later, we had become a cartoon couple, more middle-aged in our 20s than we would be in middle age. She said that, she devoted her career to the short story medium, because the demands of marriage and motherhood did not allow her to complete longer works. And eventually she realized, this is really my thing, this is my strength. Even if when she had the time to write novels, she realized that was not for her. Oh, sorry, they did move to Victoria. Munro's bookstore is in Victoria, not in Vancouver. And she said, they opened it in 1963, and as I said, it's still functioning because one of the women who works there is now trying, or at least in July, when the revelation came out about what the second husband did, what to do with this bookstore. So that was very nice that she was able to open a bookstore. And her husband was very nice. He was very proud of his wife for having opened up this bookstore. And she said that my husband would tell everybody that my wife was so talented, and she had, after owning this bookstore and having all these books which she described as crappy books, that she could write something better and put them alongside those titles. After her marriage ended to the first husband in 1972, she moved back to Ontario. She reconnected with Gerald Fremlin, the second husband, who she had known from back there and shared pages in that literary magazine back in their university days. And what struck me as interesting, if you've read this collection, is that in those 3 linked stories, the one where Juliet meets she's this young, brilliant classics, she's working on her PhD, and she gets a job teaching part-time, teaching temporarily in Vancouver. She's originally from Ontario, and she's taking the train across Canada. And that story, you remember, there's a suicide on the train of a man that this young Juliet he was sitting in her car, and he approached her, he wanted to be friendly with her. There was nothing, there was nothing sexual about it, but he was this guy who was trying really, really hard to be friendly, and she rebuffs his advances. And she feels terrible about it for a little bit, but not so terrible, except that he jumps in front of the train, and then she feels a little bit terrible again. And the way Alice Munro writes about it, she writes that she doesn't romanticize this Juliet, this romantic Juliet name. Shakespeare is in the book, by the way, a lot. There are a lot of Shakespeare references in these stories. So Juliet, with this name that her parents have given her, she meets another guy on that same train ride where this poor man has jumped in front of the train, And then she meets him briefly, and like there's this brief, intense attraction, and she gets off the train and he gets off the train, and then he sends her a letter, and he tells her while he meets her, and you look back and you think, oh gosh, this is like this guy, but when she meets him, she has no idea. Yes, he has a wife, but his wife is paralyzed. She's been in an accident, and like one of the, it's true, but one of the very good pickup lines, but she's young and she's innocent, but she falls for him, and she goes looking for him, then 6 months later, and she appears on his doorstep. Meanwhile, he already has another lady friend down the road, because this guy's quite the mover, but she moves in with him, and they don't get married, because marriage is too, too regular. And so they live together. She has a daughter with him, these three linked stories. At one point in the second story, and so it's this surprise ending where she doesn't really know what happens to her, but now her life is going to begin. Instead of becoming a classics professor, as she was planning on doing, she's now living in some rain-drenched place on Vancouver Island with this guy who is a prawn fisherman, who doesn't have any books on his bookcase. He only has Popular Mechanics magazines, but she's totally smitten with him as well. That's how the first story of the trio ends. Then the second one, she goes back to visit her parents. She has a daughter, Penelope, which fits the idea that she studies Greek classics, right? Except that, you think about the meaning of these names. She goes back and she brings the daughter, goes all the way up to visit her parents. And her parents, turns out, are this hippie couple that are sort of odd in their own right. And the second story deals with her coming back and seeing her parents with her little toddler, very young daughter. And the third story in the collection is when Penelope is now a young woman, what's happened to Juliet in the next years. As I say, what she does is she looks at the lives of these girls and women as they get older, from the time that they're young women till the time that they're older women. And what happens, I'm not going to give it away because I'm hoping that you'll read it. And it's a story of loss and of tragedy, at least when I was reading it, thought so. But it's life, and it's what happens. So those are the three linked stories. And then after that, you have another one called Passion, in which a young woman she's 20 years old, she's working at a waitress in a hotel in a small town, again in that holiday area of southern Ontario, and she is very smart. She just finished high school, and as she explains to us, she finished high school so late because she took an extra year because she wanted to study all these subjects that she was so interested in before she'd have to go and make a living. She's an orphan, she lives with her aunt and uncle. Her uncle has a chair caning business, which she is expected to go and help him and take over because they've been so kind, his aunt and uncle having raised her. But meanwhile, she's working in this hotel in the summer, and a family comes to have, there's a restaurant, and this family comes to eat, and there's a son in the family he's an engineering student, and he falls for her, and he's, and he's very decent and kind, and it's kind of assumed that, and they go out, and that he's interested in her, and he wants to marry her, but then there's a stepbrother who comes in, and then there's an episode in which something happens, thus the story is named Passion, and something happens there, and there's another ending, where something happens and things don't turn out the way she expects, but we don't know in that story how things turn out. And that story begins where she says, I haven't been here in 40 years, and I was trying to find the so-and-so's country house, but things have changed and the roads aren't the same. So it's this, she does this very often. She looks back from the vantage point of many years later. Sometimes she fills you in on what happens to her characters, and sometimes she doesn't. Another story is called Trespasses. I won't go into the details. I mean, it's too hard, because they're different short stories to go into each of them. Another one is called Tricks, and it's a story with a trick ending in which Shakespeare features predominantly, because there's a young woman a small town somewhere in southern Ontario, near Stratford, becomes a nurse about once, and she has an older sister who has such severe asthma that this older sister is not able even to go out in the winter, and she's very sickly. And so this younger sister, Robin, the parents are no longer alive, is expected that she's going to give her life to looking after her invalid older sister. But once a year, Robin, the main character, treats herself, and they don't have very much money, the two sisters, because Joanne, the older one, can't work because this asthma is so crippling to her that they live on the salary, it seems, of Robin, who's become the nurse. Once a year, she goes to see a Shakespeare play at Stratford-on-Avon. And something happens one summer when she goes to see one play a year. That's all she can afford. Has to be a matinee because they're cheaper. She takes the train from wherever this town is that she lives to Stratford. She sees the play. That's enough for her to sustain her for the whole year thinking about this play. So this is not a usual girl either in the small town that she lives in. Something happens, she meets a man, and then there's tricks, and something doesn't quite work out. And by the end of the story, we meet her like some 40 years later-ish. That seems to be like what Alice Munro in this collection likes to do, maybe because of the age she was when she wrote the stories. And we find out just what a trick, and there's something very Shakespeare-like. It's to do with twins and tricks, and that story is called Tricks. The final story of the book is the longest one, and it's wonderful. It's called Powers. It begins in 1927 with a diary, the voice of this young woman writing in the first-person diary. And Alice Munro is such a good writer that she can, without any like fanfare, she just writes from the point of view, the first-person point of view of this young girl, Nancy, who is 1927, living in a small town in Ontario, I'm not sure exactly how old she is, but maybe, early 20s and 1927, so she has to get married. So she describes, how, that was the thing, girls had to get married. And she gets herself engaged to a doctor, and then, and she has one other girl who she's friendly with. Anyway, a whole thing ensues. And we meet her again some 40-something years later when she tells us what's happened. And by that time, she's a 67-year-old woman who's a widow, and who's just come back from a cruise, a geriatric cruise, as she calls it, where there are lots and lots and lots of widows and a couple of widowers, and like the imbalance in the ratio. And she meets up with this fellow who she knew way back the summer when she got engaged to the doctor. He was the cousin, Ollie is the cousin of the doctor who she had been married to for years, who turns out to have been not such a nice guy, and just all the things that happened in the intervening years. So it's a collection, it's hard to sum it up. It's easier to discuss, let's say, story by story if people have read it and to look at each sentence, but no time to do that here. So just to tell you that this collection is, I think, an example of the craftsmanship of Alice Munro. Either if you enjoy her stories, if you don't, some are maybe more grabbing or will mean more to you personally. Everybody comes with their own, what they like and what appeals to them. But it's a very good, when I was trying to pick, now that, Alice Munro has not been writing, and she retired officially from writing in 2013. She announced that she was going to retire from writing. It was her second husband, the Gerald Fremkin, had just passed away, and she stopped writing. So there are no more Alice Munro, newer books to read. So I was trying to figure which one, and I remembered that I had really been quite taken with the stories in this collection. You can read any of her books, I think, and you'll find the stories. She writes in a certain way. So now, so what do you do now, or what do we do, or do we do anything, is the question, that, Alice Munro's reputation has posthumously been tarnished, or has it been? Should it be? I don't know, I'm throwing this out to you by the fact that, according to, and let's see how it is, Oh, there was a good art, and just to redo this. So there was an article that appeared in the National Post in July, just after this past July, just after this article written by Alice Munro's daughter. And he says, and he writes it in defense of Alice Munro's legacy. The cancel culture crowd is gunning for Nobel Prize winner Alice Munro, one of Canada's most distinguished authors. It's been open season since her daughter, Andrea Robin Skinner, and it's funny because now I look and Robin is one of the names of the characters in the stories in Runaway, published the gut-wrenching account of her mother's betrayal on learning she had been sexually abused by her stepfather. And this episode, the real life episode, could read like an Alice Munro short story. Like, that's the part that just struck me, because what she writes about, lives of girls and women and the men around them and children and raising children and the way parents do things that are not good for their children, because people are people, and even though you're a parent doesn't mean that you do everything right and that you can put your own desires ahead of those of your children, which is how you should do things as a parent, but of course should and how things are actually done are very different. But this whole episode could be an Alice Munro short story, because her women are often driven, and in these stories they do things that if people were rational beings, which we're not, then they wouldn't act like that. But, so here you go. So here you have Alice Munro, whose daughter came to her, apparently, and told her that the stepfather, that Alice Munro's husband, was abusing her, had abused her when she was 9 years old, and she told her mother, not when it was happening, but years after. And that too, that's one of the saddest parts of the story, is that victims of this kind of abuse the effects are with them for the rest of their lives, because they suffer, as apparently this daughter did, from bulimia and anorexia and depression, because when the child grows up, and 9 years old is like very young, and it stopped when she reached adolescence, so she was a very, very young child. But these things damage a person, and so she says that she told her mother years later. Munro left her husband briefly, apparently not because of his child abuse, but because of what she perceived as his infidelity. So Munro left her husband because she thought that he was having affairs, but not because he abused her daughter. She refused to discuss, Alice Munro, refused to discuss the matter further, insisting that what happened in Skinner's childhood was between her and her stepfather. In 2005, Skinner, the daughter, Robin, gave the police letters Fremlin had written that acknowledged what he had done, but shifted the blame to her, a 9-year-old. He was charged, convicted, and given a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. So he went to trial, and in this article, it says, yes, he went to trial. He was tried there in the court of Goodrich, Ontario, and the former Crown attorney who prosecuted Alice Munro's husband said that he always assumed that a desire to protect the author's reputation was among the reasons why Gerald Fremlin's sexual abuse of Munro's daughter went unreported even after he pleaded guilty. Fremlin's case also may have escaped public attention because it moved unusually quickly through the Goodrich, Ontario court system in 2005. And then he says, not too many, the Crown attorney who prosecuted the husband said that not too many people knew about it, and about his guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to these charges of indecent assault dating back to 1976. He said that most people thought that it was because most of Munro's family did not want to harm her reputation by revealing that her husband was a sexual offender. He said, the attorney who prosecuted, I just assumed that everyone was protecting the mother. I mean, I know that the daughter isn't happy with how it was handled, but Munro didn't do anything criminal wrong, which you couldn't She didn't do anything criminally wrong. Morally is another question, right? She was told in her essay published earlier this month, Skinner, that's Alice Munro's daughter, wrote that Fremlin sexually abused and harassed her starting at age 9 during her visits to see her mother in Clinton, Ontario, a small town not far from Goodrich. She was in her 20s when she told her mother about the abuse, but Munro sided with Fremlin and stayed in the marriage until his death. Skinner wrote, detailing how her childhood trauma remained a family secret for decades. Skinner also wrote that her father, Alice Munro's first husband, Jim Munro, never acted decisively to protect her, and that her mother's Nobel Prize-winning fame meant that the silence continued. So, and you could write, you could talk about this more, but here we have a very, and not so rare, up-to-date version of what do you do with the art and the art and the artist. And then you have the same article about this McGill professor not knowing whether he should go on with his graduate seminar course at McGill this coming winter semester on Alice Munro. And he said that he does believe, this professor said that he believes in separating the art from the artist, that we have all done bad things. And it's a big conflict. Like he said, but what do? Writers are not saints or would-be saints. Artists are not all, their behavior is not exemplary. Do you not look at their paintings? What do you do? I don't know. I remember like for years there was always this idea of should Wagner be played by the, remember that from years ago, by the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra? Should you do that because he was, he was the favorite of the monster Hitler. So that's an extreme example, okay, so that really, and that was maybe a little more complicated, but what do you do here with Alice Munro, the Canadian literary icon? She didn't commit the abuse herself, but how did she act morally? Was that something? Do we not read her stories now because of that? I don't know. I don't think so, because then I think, as somebody wrote, if we would go through the shelves at libraries, then our libraries would be kind of empty if we found out everything about what every author, famous or not so famous, did in their lives that was not the right thing to do. Anyway, there won't be any more, Alice Munro passed away earlier this year. She retired from writing in 2013, but her work is considered among the finest example of the short story ever written in the English language. So past 3 o'clock, comments, questions, I'm happy to state. But those of you who read it or who heard about the whole, anyway. No? Nobody? Yeah.
Has she ever written poetry?
Not that I know of. She didn't know.
If she wanted something direct and to the heart,
Yeah.
that could have been her genre.
Look, I guess hers was not. Hers was the short story in which she packed so much about a life of a character in such a way that she could, as they keep, I keep reading this over and over, that you feel like you read a novel, but it's only a short story. So, and that takes great skill. She was a consummate short story writer. Anyway, thank you very much.
We have a comment from the Zoom.
Yes.
Lynn says, it's wonderful to be here, if only virtually. Thank you for this review. Happy holidays to everyone. She says, I am deeply disappointed in Munro as a mother. Her lack of support of her daughter was inexcusable. However, I do believe that it is important to separate the art from the artist while never ever forgetting.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Well, it
Thank you,
reminds
Lynn.
me of this Michael Jackson controversy, because he was not for my generation necessarily, but for younger people.
Yeah.
They revered him and his music and his moves,
Yeah.
and then
His personal
the
life
scandal,
was
his personal life was terrible.
Yeah.
So that's the same idea. Do
Yeah,
we
yeah.
ignore his music? Do they forget about him as an
And really, as you say, it's age old, the I don't know, Mozart and yes.
Very often, when something like this comes out, people don't want, in general, because I've heard that it's not necessarily sexual abuse, but any type of abuse or something happening.
Yeah.
People don't, like the daughter went to the mother didn't want to recognize it. very often they say, oh, you must be imagining it. I've heard that from people.
Yeah.
So it's not
But
uncommon.
he admitted in court. that
Yeah,
he
but that was later, he admitted it, that's true. So
Okay,
he,
so that was in 2004, so she was what?
no, but she was already older,
Yeah, she was 30.
and he was prosecuted for it. So it
Any
was,
occupation, which is.
yeah, but it was out in the open, it's not as if it wasn't in the open.
I mean, it went to court, he
Yeah.
was sentenced,
So
and he was
it was in
sentenced
the open.
guilty,
So
but
it's not as if
it didn't seem to tarnish her reputation. Not too many people knew, I guess they don't follow the court, what goes on in the courts in Goodrich, Ontario, because
I'm sure some people knew, but they didn't want to know, you know, people don't want to know those things, it's so common,
yeah.
they don't want to know.
Yeah.
So why it's all coming up now, I mean, it's.
Well,
not-
she wrote the article, she waited until her daughter wrote the article in the Toronto Star
I know,
in
but-
July of this past year after her mother had
I
passed
know,
away.
but to me, I'm not saying her mother was morally right, but it doesn't have anything to do with her work.
No, it's just that when you read it, and admittedly, rereading these stories now, knowing this, because it was so much part of her work. You know, the characters did things that were like, it fits so, sadly, but it fits so well, it could be an Alice Munro short story, somebody could write it. Yeah.
Because you write what you know and what you live.
So that's
That's
exactly what she says, so she creates these, the lives of the girls and women that she wrote about were very often from small town southern Ontario, and they were really, you know, very smart young women, bright young women who didn't fit in, or the mothers were sick, and you know, yes, she wrote about it, yeah.
She took different people.
Yeah. Did you?
What I
Yeah.
was saying